The Madman Theory is a premise that says that if you act or make it seem like you can act in a crazy manner in a bargaining situation, that it might be possible to extract concessions from the other side that you otherwise would not be able to do. The idea that you would go to the extreme or that you would take incredibly risky actions, in theory, would prompt a more rational actor to say, it's not worth it, I will make some small concessions as a result, and thereby avoiding an actual conflict. I think it's one strategy behind Donald Trump's behavior. I think to say that it's everything, explains everything that Donald Trump does would be inaccurate. But there's no denying that there are times where Donald Trump does want to be thought of as crazy, and there's been widespread reporting of instances in which Trump has told his negotiators to tell the other side, tell them that I'm crazy, tell them that I could do anything, and that's a classic madman gambit. The most well-documented instance is actually during his first term when Trump was renegotiating KORUS, which was the U.S.-South Korea trade treaty. He wanted somewhat more preferential terms, and he told his U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, to tell the South Koreans, I could do anything. Trump could do anything. He could be extremely, unpredictable. He could back out of the treaty now in the hopes that this would lead to greater concessions. Similarly, you could argue that Trump's behavior towards Kim Jong-un of North Korea during his first year in office in his first term, where, he talked about fire and fury, and he called Kim Jong-un Rocket Man and intimated that he would be prepared to go to war with North Korea, was an effort to try to get North Korea to the bargaining table. You could argue that the reciprocal tariffs in particular, the idea that he was placing tariffs on the entire world, certainly would potentially be, look like a madman gambit. Yes, that's a possibility. There are a few circumstances where it might work. Generally speaking, if the person pulling the madman gambit is seen as having extreme preferences on just one issue, whereas otherwise they do seem rational, that might be an instance where the other side is perfectly willing, or at least would be willing to consider making concessions. And there's been work by a variety of IR scholars suggesting that. On the whole, however, as a strategy, it tends not to work very well, for a variety of reasons that I could get into if you want. But there are certain circumstances under which maybe it can work as a short-term gambit. The one other condition where it might work better is, frankly, if you're engaging in the madman gambit with long-standing allies. And that's the other sort of trademark of Trump. He tends to actually be more coercive towards allies than towards adversaries, because he's convinced that allies have somehow given the United States a raw deal. And there are many instances in which an ally might make a concession to a country like the United States in the belief that this is a one-time thing and it's worth giving the concession in the short term to maintain the relationship in the long term. Well, there's a couple of problems with the madman theory. The most obvious is that anytime you engage in an act of coercive bargaining, you have to make two forms of credible commitment. First, you have to credibly commit that if the other side doesn't acquiesce, you will do something, you will punish, you will take coercive action. That threat has to be credible even if it's costly to yourself. But the second credible commitment is that if the target acquiesces, you have to credibly commit that you will stop sanctioning, that you will stop punishing, that you will accept the bargain. What the madman gambit does is that it makes the first threat credible, but at the risk of undermining what we call the assurance dilemma. It undermines the credibility that the actor will actually lift sanctions or stop punishing. And this is a real problem, particularly for Donald Trump. Anytime Trump acts like this, and the thought of the target might be, well, maybe we can cut a deal, the question you always have to ask yourself is, do you trust Donald Trump to stick to any bargain that he strikes? It's telling that in his second term, the very first states that he targeted for tariffs were Canada and Mexico, the two countries of the USMCA, the one trade treaty that Donald Trump negotiated. Sometimes if you try to pull the madman gambit once, or if you initially do it and you throw the target off guard, it can work as a surprise tactic. And to be fair to Donald Trump, this is what he has sometimes said in terms of his theory of negotiating. He thinks the United States should be more unpredictable. And so the idea is by pulling these gambits, you might surprise the other side once and get them to make concessions that they otherwise would not make. The problem is that over time, what inevitably happens is that first, the actor trying to attempt the madman gambit gets addicted to it. If they get a concession the first time, they're going to think, I can do this again and again and again and again and again. And it might be the targets eventually start stiffening their spine. So that's one reason. That's the most obvious reason that it tends not to work over time. The second reason, and this is particularly unique to Trump, is what I like to call the Fight Club rule, which is the first rule of the madman gambit is that you can't say out loud you're doing the madman gambit. The moment you make it clear to everyone that you're acting crazy, that you're not actually crazy, well, then the other side has the incentive to call your bluff in that instance. And the thing about Donald Trump is that he always talks about doing the madman gambit. He's the one who said, I need to be more unpredictable. He's the one for whom there's reporting in which he's attempted to pretend to behave like he's mad. And what is noteworthy is that throughout his first term, generally speaking, when Trump tried to coerce adversaries, countries like Iran or North Korea or China or Russia, essentially there wound up being a pattern, which is either he would back down if the other side refused to back down, or he would agree to extremely minimal concessions and then walk away claiming that he had won. So think about the Phase 1 trade deal with China, for example, or the summits with North Korea, or in the case of Iran or Russia, really in the end he winds up backing down mostly. Probably democracies might be a little more vulnerable to the madman gambit than autocracies. With autocracies, they don't have to worry as much about public opinion, and a madman issuing a threat in some instances can just be censored entirely. Whereas there is experimental evidence showing that when someone acts like a madman, if you poll publics, publics tend to want to see concessions made. They don't want to have to deal with the madman. And so there's probably a slight probability that it's going to work better with democracies than with autocracies. I don't think so. I mean, there's no denying that there's a style of leader that Trump represents, the sort of, populist nationalist. It's worth noting that Trump is not the first in this category. You could argue Silvio Berlusconi of Italy, fit this mold, or Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines. There are plenty of populist nationalists out there. What I don't think is true, however, is that most of them lack the power to even consider the madman gambit, because the threat that they're going to issue in terms of punishing isn't all that credible. Because you actually have to have some capabilities for the threat to at least be somewhat plausible. And so that makes Trump really sui generis in that sense. Yes, it's extremely dangerous. As I said, the madman gambit can work in the short term, but at some point, one of two things happens. Either a state decides we're not going to deal with this anymore, we're not going to give in, and that puts the person playing the madman gambit in an extremely awkward situation. They have one of two choices at that point. They can either back down, and if they back down, their reputation takes a hit, and their ability to use the madman gambit in the future basically gets undermined. Or they actually act like the madman, in which they're willing to take the risk, they take provocative action. That tends to lead to trade wars or actual wars, and that's costly for all sides. And the problem with Donald Trump is that he was president for 4 years. He's got a track record on this. He tends to back down when confronting adversaries if the adversaries stand firm. And we're seeing this right now with the trade war with China, for example, where China's shown zero inclination that they want to back down. And it's rather Trump that has actually made a carve-out for consumer electronics, for example. It's Trump who backed down on the so-called reciprocal tariffs when he realized that markets weren't reacting well. So if you're another country, particularly if you're China or the European Union, and you're looking at Trump, you're not necessarily intimidated by him. You don't necessarily think he's a madman.